right. So PHP 7.4 has this new feature called type properties. Typed class properties. And there are a lot of PHP developers that are pretty upset about this. And I'm not exactly sure why. So one of the reasons I'm not sure why is because they are completely optional. These typed properties on PHP 7.4, typed class properties, are absolutely and 100% optional. You don't need to use them. Number two is, not only are they optional, they actually allow you to declare the strict type. And it's literally declare, parentheses, strict types, 1 for true, 0 for false. Now, if you set it to 1 and you set it to strict types, it will act like traditional strict type or property typing, like Java or C++. If you set the property type to int and you pass in a string, then it will throw an error. Duh. But if you set it to 0, if you set it to false, PHP actually has this feature I really like. And say you set the name property as a string, and then the property type is a string, but then you set it to false, well, PHP 7.4 will actually set it to an empty string. Even though the type is string and you tried to set it to false, which is a Boolean, traditionally in typed languages, especially strict ones, and not especially, in strict languages, it would throw an error. This is of type string. You cannot set it as a Boolean. In PHP 7.4, if you declare the strict types as non-strict, declare strict types is 0, it equals 0, and you try to set a string type to false, it will not throw an error. It won't do it. It actually does this really cool thing where it will automatically set it to an empty string, which is technically false in PHP. Again, this is also optional. More than that, you don't have to use types at all. So on top of this, and I'm bringing this up because I had a video on it. I've had a lot of people just comment on it saying, man, they really don't like this. This is for Java. This is for C++. This is for C. This is way too verbose. Types, what's the point of PHP anymore? Guys, like, it's optional, one. But two is, what is the purpose of typing? A lot of people, they see typing and they're like, why is it there? And I've been doing a lot of research on preconditions and postconditions, specifically in reference to the Liskop substitution principle, which is the next solid video I have coming out here, hopefully in the next week or two. And I've learned about a lot about preconditions and postconditions. A lot of really cool things. But check this. In mathematics, in a traditional function, so just say you have a function, the function has input, you do something with that input, then you return the output. Okay, that's a function. Function, input, return output. Function, input, do something, return output. A precondition. Function input, the precondition would be check to make sure the input is valid. It will work in this function. That's a precondition. A precondition, before we can do anything on the input of a function, is we are going to preconditionally check. We're going to add a conditional and check something before we do something with the input. Then we do something with the input. A postcondition, on the other hand, is saying, okay, we're going to do a check right before we return the output. So we have a precondition and we have a postcondition. Between those is our actual function, and then right after a postcondition, we return something. That's preconditions and postconditions. Now, if you were to do preconditions and postconditions without typing, specifically parameter typing or return typing, then you would have to add literally 6 lines of code. And if you want to do an inline if, then it would just be, sometimes 2. But at least if you're using brackets, like most if statements do, if this condition is true, then you're good. Otherwise, throw an exception. And then that's a precondition. Do your thing. If this is true, then don't throw an exception. Else throw an exception. Like, guys, we're talking about like 6 lines of code, sometimes 9 or 12 lines of code. Now, what's typing do? Well, if you type your parameters, the input to the function, you say the input has to be this specific type, we're literally adding a precondition without needing to add the if conditional within the function. Now, if you, in PHP, add the colon right after the parameters and you enforce a return type, that's a post condition. So all these arguments with typing and being verbose and et cetera, guys, in a lot of cases, I completely agree. In fact, most of the time, I don't type inputs and I don't type outputs. I don't enforce the typing. But there are certain scenarios, like when I'm adding an if this is the input thing, then we can do this function, and before we return it, we have to add another conditional, the precondition and the postcondition. Well, guys, if you add types, you can get rid of those 6 to 9 lines, and you can just make a longer line on the parameter, the function, parentheses, parameters, put types in front of the parameters, right after parentheses, colon, type the return value. So you can actually enforce preconditions and postconditions using types. Now, why is this huge? Why do we want to use preconditions and postconditions? Well, imagine that whenever you have a bug, we're going to get kind of abstract here. Imagine when you have a bug in your application. And you don't have preconditions or postconditions. So even though your function returns a value that is not going to work with the rest of your software, and say 20 frames after, a frame being like debugging frames, if you're familiar with Xdebug, each frame that you can go through and debug with. It's what's called, without the preconditions and postconditions within a function, if the function returns a value or does something on the value that we don't expect because we don't have those conditionals there to enforce what we actually want to happen, and that input gets changed in the function, then returned from the function, and doesn't fail until 20 frames later, 25, 30 frames later, and then it fails, we've infected our application. So something that could have been encapsulated, some bug that could have been encapsulated to a single frame to the function, so when it fails and we know that it fails, then we can go directly to that portion of our code, of our software. If we don't have those preconditions and postconditions, that returned value, that can go further in our application, and then it doesn't work. And so typing is a way to minimize infectious behavior of bugs in our application. And the last thing we want is for a single bug, because we returned the wrong type, for example. We returned a string of 0 instead of the integer 0, and that messes up a calculation further down in the process and the runtime. And say it gets 40 frames later. Well, now because we didn't have that precondition or postcondition, instead of being able to go directly to that function and saying, oh, hey, that's what we're doing wrong, like the input to this wasn't correct, the output wasn't correct, because we had the precondition or postcondition, aka we had the typed parameters and the typed return values, typed parameters, precondition, typed return value, postcondition. We didn't allow our bug to infect the next 39 frames of code of the runtime. And so, guys, my take on types, and to be honest, I opt out of using types more often than not. But my take on types is this: understand why they're useful. Like, it's so easy to complain about how verbose they are, because they are verbose, and a lot of times people use them and they don't even know why they're using them, or people use them and they're only using them because they want to be the technically sound engineer, but they still don't know why. or how that makes it more technically sound. Understand why we use typing. Understand what preconditions and postconditions are and why they're so useful, and how they eliminate infectious behaviors of bugs in our application. And then I would leave you with this piece of advice. Use typing. Use it when it's useful. Simple advice, but that goes on with almost everything and anything in software. One of the things that I have said over and over is I strive to be a declarative minimalist. I try to declare what I'm saying, give some semantic or germane cognitive load. If you watched the last car ride video, I try to give it some semantics, some good wording, I try to write out my code in a good way. I try to keep it to one indent, two indents at most. And when I say one indent, I'm saying if you have a class and then you have a function, keep it to one indent within that function. If you have to go two indents, then you should probably abstract some of that to a different function or a different class or whatever. But try to be a declarative minimalist. Try to keep your code on the left side of the page. Try to keep it to a minimum amount of indents. Don't use acronyms. Spell things out. Try to give your code some semantics, some understanding via context. And these more technical things like typing, especially class property types and functional parameter types and return types, understand how they're useful, what preconditions and postconditions are, how they eliminate the infectious behavior of bugs, and if you see a place where you're checking or adding a custom precondition and a custom postcondition within a function, replace that with types. Use them when they're useful. So guys, that's all I got today. If this was useful, insightful, you learned something new about preconditions and postconditions, about typing and why we type, and if you like some of the insights or these are just helpful, like and subscribe below, and I'll keep these videos coming. As always guys, I appreciate it, and clean code, clean life.